Hello everyone. Welcome back to another tier list. This is where we left off around 3 patches ago. As many of you know, a massive patch has just hit, 14.10, so there's going to be quite a few changes in this list. Plus, I've also missed out on 2 patches, so you know that there's going to be some shiftings in the tier lists. Before we get into it, I do want to say tier lists are subjective. Everyone clicks differently with champions. Some people find one style of champion very easy. A person would find another style of champion very easy. So the styles of champions that we prefer are quite subjective. So don't take this as the absolute truth, right? Because everyone is different and everyone is subjective as to how they can perform on certain champions. This is just my generalized opinion from coaching and reviewing a lot of games at the lower end of the ladder. Next thing I want to say, this tier list is aimed at lower MMR players. If you're above Diamond, it might be useful still, but I would recommend sticking to the champions that I'm suggesting if you're below Diamond. Above Diamond, I don't have that many viewers that are above Diamond, so I don't think making a tier list is worth it. The final thing I want to say about the tier list as a disclaimer, this is not necessarily a tier list meant for complete 1v9 performance, right? This is a tier list meant for consistency over the span of a lot of games. These champions will give you better results. It's not like these champions will absolutely 1v9 every game, but you'll have a positive impact on the game over the span of a lot of games, which will eventually lead you to climbing. You don't have to 1v9 every game, or you just have to outperform a majority of the games. And also, if you want to, check out my Patreon. I upload commentaries. There's going to be quite a few on this new patch, so go check that out if you want to. But let's get into the tier list, shall we? So, the first thing that we need to do is we need to salute our boy Corki. This guy is getting pulled out of the mid lane tier list. He is no longer a mid laner. It seems Riot is quite intent on pushing Corki down into the bottom lane. So I'm going to take him off the list, and we're going to see if he comes on later. Maybe he's still viable mid lane, but for now, I'll take him out of the list. Next thing we need to do is we need to add some champions. So Kennen, I think this champion is actually quite viable mid lane as well. I've played him a little bit recently after his ult changes, and he feels very smooth. I think he's quite good at the lower end of the ladder. He can bully lane, he farms well, and he's strong in team fights. So I do think he deserves a slot in the B tier. High B tier, low A tier is where I would put him. Probably even A tier, actually. Next, we have Morgana. I haven't had Morgana in a tier list for a while because I just don't think she's very good. But at the low end of the ladder, if you're an Iron, Bronze, or Silver, Morgana mid lane is actually one of the highest win rate champions in the game. So for that reason, I'll give her an honorary mention and put her in the C tier. I don't think you should play her if you're gold and above. It's just not worth it. She gets bullied in lane too hard and has too many glaring weaknesses. But if you're at the lower end of the ladder, press W on the wave and win. And the last champion we need to add to the list is Viego. Why? Because Viego just received a change, as you can see here, where your Q now heals more versus minions, which means that you're probably going to be quite viable in the mid lane as well. Viego is going to be one of those annoying champions to push out of the lane, kind of like a Sylas, like a Yone, like an Akali, champion that starts with Doran's shield. Second Wind is annoying to push out of lane, but scales for fights. So I do think he is just a weaker version of the champions that I just mentioned, but I do still think he's going to be viable mid lane. Again, this tier list is quite early. I haven't played any games on the patch. I'm just looking at the patch notes. I'll probably release a second one when I've actually played some games on the patch and we've seen how it shakes out. Next, let's talk about Tryndamere. I think Tryndamere mid lane is a very good AD option for lower MMR players, and they're just barely changing his crit threshold. Don't have to really look too far into it, but I figured it makes sense to go down the list of patches and champions. So we're going to start with champions, and then we're going to start talking about items afterwards and how items might affect champion changes in the standings, right? But first, Tryndamere, I think he deserves an A tier slot. I've underrated him a little bit too much. I think this champion is very good in low elo. He has complete carry potential, and he will do very well over the span of a lot of games. Just make sure that you don't pick him into matchups that are a little bit hard. Matchups that he generally struggles with are champions like Ahri, Anivia. People that have zone control or a lot of mobility that can bully him in lane is quite difficult for Tryndamere, but anything else, very good for him. Yasuo and Yone, same thing. They just have their multiplier changed, which means that they're going to reach 100% crit on 2 items instead of like having 120%. Same thing as before. I don't really think this changes anything except for the fact that maybe items can impact them, but we'll talk about that when we get to the item changes. For now, we're just going to leave them in the B and C tier for lower MMR. Now we get to the changes that actually matter. The item changes. Black Fire Torch. This item is essentially going to try to become what Liandry's was before the changes, except now you also have Liandry's, so you can basically have 2 damage over time items. Yeah, I'm fairly certain you can have 2 damage over time options now, because I see Baleful Blaze, which is the damage over time, is not going to be the same as the one that is named on Liandry's. So I'm assuming you can hold both Blackfire Torch and Liandry's. Now, the main champions that come to mind when you think of something like this is the damage over time champions, obviously. So let's go back to our tier list. One champion that I think is going to benefit incredibly from this is Brand. I already love Brand. All of you know this. If you've watched any of my videos, Brand is one of my favorite mid lane champions. So I already love him. I'm going to put him in the OP tier. I think he deserves being there. Another champion that I think is actually going to come back up into the S tier for lower Mars is Malzahar. You now no longer have to build Malignant's first item. Malignance feels a little bit bad to build on Malzahar just because it doesn't really impact your E and your Q in any way. It just makes your ult a bit stronger, but it's not like you're spamming ult on Malzahar anyway. What it really did was give you more potential for solo kills because you get more burst, but that's not really what Malzahar wants. Other champions that could also rise with this is something like a Cassiopeia. I still think I'm going to keep her in the A tier. I think it makes sense to keep her there. But generally speaking, I would advise you guys to keep an eye out on mages. If Blackfire Torch is really strong, you're going to see mages go up because now they have an option to build a first item that can do quite well against the tankier matchups in mid lane. For example, previously mages really struggled against Galio or Gragas, something like that mid lane, a tanked mid laner, because you can't build Liandry's first item, so you had to build Serath into Liandry's. But now you're back to having a damage over time item that can really shred these champions. So I'd say keep an eye out on champions like Orianna, like Ziggs, like Xerath, champions that can quite consistently proc this effect, and let's see how strong they're gonna look with Blackfire Torch plus Liandry's, because if they're strong enough, then they'll shoot up this tier list. But I'm gonna keep the list where it is for now, just because I don't know how this patch is going to play out. Next, the change is going to be to Luden's Companion. Essentially what they're doing is they're making this more of a burst item. So this is now going to be a lot more specific for certain champions that really want it. The burst mages are going to want this a lot more. This is going to be an alternative to Blackfire Torch. So champions that can go both Blackfire Torch and Ludens, you're going to have to be a little bit more aware of which item suits the game state better. Does your champion need to be a DPS champion in fights if you're against a tankier team composition? Or does your champion need to be a burst champion in these fights if you're against a squishier team composition? So it's going to be an entirely new skill to navigate which of these items you need to get on champions, again, like Xerath, like Ziggs, like Orianna. I actually think due to this item change, I'm very keen on bumping up these champions one tier. Probably not Xerath, because Xerath, as we all know, after scripting got buffed, or after scripting got removed or nerfed, I suppose, with Vanguard, Xerath has dropped 5% in win rate. So I'm going to assume that we're going to be seeing a Xerath buff coming in quite soon to compensate for that. Because turns out, guys, Xerath was actually a pretty weak champion. The scripters just made him seem very broken in terms of win rates. Who could have seen that coming? Oh, what? No way! Actually very funny to think about, though. I still don't think this Luden's change is going to be enough on other champions, such as Fizz, who doesn't really build it. He's still going to build Lichbane or Storm Surge, I imagine, or Rocket Belt. Same with Akali. These champions don't really need mana. I'm going to keep them in a similar spot. Actually, Vex should go up as well. I think Vex is going to be very nice with this Luden's change, too. Lux might actually be good enough with this Luden's change to warrant jumping up into the S tier. I actually think I will put Lux into the S tier, because Ludens will now always fire at full shots, which basically means you're always getting a lot more burst on it. Now you don't need to build Malignance on Lux, you can actually go Ludens and you can find the one-shots, which is very, very nice. This might also mean that LeBlanc actually has to go up one, because she also really loves Ludens. LeBlanc might actually be a champion that can jump up multiple spots on this tier list, depending on how good this Ludens change is and how smooth it feels to play with. But again, I'm just going to put her up one, and then we're going to see. Same with Lissandra, she could jump up as well quite a lot. But again, I'm not sure. It depends on how good this Ludens change feels. These are just my initial impressions. Liandry's, the only thing that was changed was the build path. It's now Faded Ashes, this item that builds into Blackfire Torch. Don't worry too much about it. It's fine. Nothing really changes with this. Now let's get to the actual big changes in the mid lane. It's going to be mainly focused on the AD champions, because the big changes this season, or this patch, has been AD crit items. So, Bloodthirster has had its crit removed. That now just gives a bunch of AD and gives you a nice little shield with some lifesteal. This is pretty good. I can imagine a champion that really likes this is actually, funnily enough, going to be Tryndamere, because Tryndamere is now going to be able to build Phantom Dancer into Infinity Edge and then into a Bloodthirster. That seems pretty strong to me. He's going to cap out at 100% crit with that, and he's going to get an extra 80 AD, and he's going to have a shield. That might be pretty good. Outside of that, I don't really see this item being used that much in the mid lane. A lot of champions in mid lane don't really want flat AD with lifesteal. It's not very good on a lot of the casters. On casters, you'd prefer an item that just gives you AD and cooldown reduction. So if you think of something like a Jace, he, for example, would much rather prefer something like an Eclipse that gives you a bunch of AD, and it gives you cooldown reduction. Not really that useful with the lifesteal on a champion like Jace, except for very specific instances. So I don't think you'll see Bloodthirster used that much in mid lane, and champions like Tristana, for example, wants the crit, but the crit is now gone. So Bloodthirster probably not going to be built that much in mid lane. Next we have Collector. No one really builds this in mid lane anyway, so you should be fine. Like, no one should be building this item. Lethality champions don't want Collector because it gives you crit, so it's not really that useful. You don't want crit on a champion like Zed anyway. The only champion actually, Zed could be very good with Bloodthirster now that I'm thinking about it, just because Zed actually kind of likes lifesteal. The only problem is you don't get any cooldown reduction for it, and you don't get any lethality for it, which feels pretty bad for Zed. This is just not going to be a mid lane item. Essence Reaver, this is not really built on any mid laners anyway, unless you're playing Ezreal mid lane or something like that, which I don't even have on my tier list, so I don't think worry too much about it. Now we get to the big item change. This is the item change that's going to affect quite a few of the AD mid laners, the crit mid laners specifically. The big one is Tristana. The reason being is crit chance is going up to 25%. Again, this just means you need 4 crit items to have 100% crit. Means you can come online a little bit earlier. That's very nice. That's good. But the AD is going up by quite a lot, which is also going to be very, very nice for Tristana. So, what's happening here is Infinity Edge is going to get buffed. Navori is now no longer viable as a crit option because it gives you no AD. And Phantom Dancer is now going to be viable as your attack speed option. Kraken Slayer is removed as well, so for Tristana, your build path is probably going to be Phantom Dancer into Infinity Edge. What I mean by this is, or what I mean by all of this that I just said, Kraken Slayer no longer gives crit, so you can't build it on Tristana. Now, Navori's Quick Blade is changed to Navori's Flicker Blade, which gives you attack speed and no AD. That's not what Tristana wants. The reason Tristana built Navori is because it gives you so much AD, and it also allows you to keep your Q on permanently, so you have both a lot of AD and a ton of attack speed. Now that's kind of removed the entire purpose, because now you're building attack speed, so you can have your Q up more often and have more attack speed. But you don't have any attack damage, so it's not really that worthwhile, right? It's not really worth it. That is what I mean when I say the item build on Tristana is probably going to be Phantom Dancer into Infinity Edge. I think Infinity Edge is going to be pretty insane on Tristana, so I'm going to be putting her up into the S tier. And now we start seeing the dynamic of the patch kind of change what is good. I think specifically because Tristana is going to be good now, like incredibly good, that now kicks Kassadin down from the OP tier into the S tier. So now we start seeing stuff shift around a bit, right? This could also easily mean that Yasuo bumps up into the B tier. He really loves Infinity Edge, right? It again feels bad not being able to build something like a Kraken Slayer on Yasuo, but you might be able to get away with just building Bork into Phantom Dancer, into crit, or into IE, and you have a ton of damage. Bork was also buffed, so we'll see what happens with that. The last item I really want to talk about is Yuntal's Wild Arrows. So this could be an item that will be incredibly strong on certain mid laners. It could be an item that might see play on something like a Tristana, a ranged champion, where you would just go for a build that stacks a ton of AD. So imagine something like an Infinity, like a Phantom Dancer, an Infinity Edge into Yuntal's Wild Arrows, and then hit a champion once. You have like 300 AD, and you're gonna crit them for like 600 basically, and it's gonna deal a ton of that damage over time. And then we'll see if that... And then that might be really strong. I don't think you're going to be seeing this item too much in the mid lane unless it just turns out that the numbers are absolutely broken or that this cooldown is not long enough on Serrated Edge. I don't know what the cooldown is. It seems that it's just any critical strikes. So you might see it played on a champion like Tristana. You might be able to see it played on other AD mid laners. But most AD mid laners that build crit are melee, so I doubt you'll be seeing it on anything but Tristana. So the last thing that I really want to talk about is this rune called Absorb Life. Now, this is in the Precision tree. I think it goes instead of Triumph, or it goes instead of Overheal, as I can see here. So it's up in the top with Triumph, Presence of Mind, and Absorb Life. This rune is going to be incredible on champions like Akali, champions that will build Doran's shield basically. So Akali, Viego, Yone, Yasuo, Sylas are all going to love this rune because it makes them incredibly difficult to push out of the lane. Specifically because of that, I think I am willing to put Viego in the A tier as a mid laner. We're going to see if I'm going to end up looking like an absolute fool. Specifically also for that, I'm willing to put Yone in the A tier because the only weaknesses that these champions have is during the early stages. You have just given them a rune along with Fleet Footwork and along with Second Wind that now gives you, well, basically just an entirely new HP bar in the laning phase, like much more health again, which is going to make these champions even harder to push out of the lane, which now means that they can get to their spikes even easier. So specifically for that reason, I'm going to move those champions up. But I think that's kind of all I have for the list. I think I'm quite happy with this list. I think a lot of champions aren't going to be that affected in the mid lane. The only thing that's really going to shake up this list is if other champions in other roles or certain item dynamics play out in a way that can change the mid lane. But the mid lane pool isn't changed that much by these patches. So, with that being said, thank you all for watching, and check out the Patreon if you want to. Enjoy. I'll upload another one of these videos later when we see how the patch plays out, but hopefully you enjoy your